Let's take a look at this colorful piece on the upper part of the skirt. These two are the back pieces. Note this edge of the opening at the back of the back piece. We leave a 1 centimeter seam allowance. This makes it easier to fold in the edge later. Then there are 2 sleeves. Remember to turn the 2 sleeves inside out and sketch on both sides. Then leave a 1 centimeter allowance at the bottom edge. Finally, leave a normal 5 millimeter seam allowance for the front piece, except for the few positions I just mentioned. The rest follows the standard 5 millimeter style. Next, we talk about the skirt section. For the skirt, the top and bottom edges follow the standard 5 millimeter design style. The sides have a 1 centimeter design. This is because the sides need to be sewn to the opening at the back of the upper part. We need to standardize the inward folding edge shortly. Let's discuss the threading here. In this section about threads, I used single layer thread. This means one side is knitted and won't fray. The thread that we frequently use, it needs to be folded like this. Folding it will definitely make it thicker. Regarding what we have below this time, it also needs to piece together a skirt. The skirt is also gathered, so I suggest using single layer threads. This design is slightly thinner, making it look more natural. Now, let's take a look at this size. For example, I use single layer threads for this one, and it has writing on it. For example, this is 0.7 plus 0.5 on top. The 0.7 at the bottom is the outer section. The 0.5 on top represents the design style. If you need to fold it, it can actually be folded and ironed. It's the same with this part. Its size, the lower part after folding is 0.7. The top part is 0.5. Of course, the exact amount is, you should follow what's on your drawings. Some are larger in size. It could be 1 centimeter. Then add this 0.5 specification. The specifications on both sides are included. No need to add anything extra. Remember to outline the design like I do. This way, it will be easier to sew the side seams later. The collar value for this edition, I used fusible interfacing to turn the fabric over. This is the fabric at the bottom. I'm using fusible interfacing. The top layer is made of 60s washed cotton. For those without fusible interfacing, if you don't want to buy it, you just stack the 2 layers directly on top of each other. This is similar to the 60 count washed cotton. Just sew it together like this with the fronts facing each other. Here we also sew with the front sides together. Use the smooth side of this interfacing as the front. We do not sew along this inner edge. Then sew along this outer edge. When sewing, focus on the starting and ending points. Leave a 5 millimeter margin outward. After finishing the sewing, we cut off this collar. Use lace scissors on the stitched areas. Unstitched areas, normally leave a 5 millimeter seam allowance. Flip it over and press it flat. The finished collar looks like this, because the back uses interfacing, so there are no visible sewing lines. The edges are also more fitted, relatively flat. Sisters who use regular fabric, if you are skilled at marking lines with the vehicle, you can quickly mark the edge of the circle with the vehicle. It will also be smoother. Then we take this blueprint, align the edges as you take it out. Draw the style line above this collar value. Draw it on the front side. Once the 2 collar values are handled, it looks like this. Let's keep it on standby for now. Here we will stitch the upper part together. This is the front piece. Then these are the 2 sleeves. These are the 2 back pieces. This is the position of the back opening. Pay attention while we are sewing. The sleeves have a designated front and back. The back position is sewn together with the back piece. The front position is sewn together with the front piece. Then set it according to my placement. Sew the 2 adjacent edges together like this, facing each other. This is what it looks like once it's stitched together. Now let's turn it to the back. Position the stitched edges we just made. Spread them all apart to the sides. Just iron it flat. Sisters who like to measure the thread can also measure the thread marks. Measure along both sides of the design. Next, let's work on the collar. Before attaching the collar, first, let's fold the neckline of the front piece here. Find the center point and make a mark. Next, the position of the opening at the back. We have a marking point here, the same position as shown on the drawing. Create the marking points on both sides. When putting on the collar, the position of the collar's edge. Align it with the marking points at the back and center. Additionally, note one issue. Especially for some sisters, what you use tends to be baggy. If this type of knit fabric has a lot of elasticity, when we put on the collar, you can easily mismatch the collar with the neckline size. For instance, the one I'm currently using is also quite baggy. You can just compare it directly. You will notice that it's a bit short because of the position of the collar. We have made a cut here. You can closely examine the texture in this area. It will stretch slightly, so when we sew it, we need to push it slightly forward like this. But you also can't let it crease. In other words, just let it gather a little tighter. Next, we will sew this collar into place. Ensure that the front of the collar and the underside fabric are all facing upwards. This is what it looks like after sewing. Then we fold the edge of the collar down. Next, sew a visible stitch around the collar area. Starting and ending points. We can simply fold along the position of this 5 millimeter style. Here I've sewn 2 lines using a visible thread. It's simply 1 line at 1 millimeter. Then I sewed another line with a 1 millimeter gap. You can choose according to your own preferences. If you like it, for example, it can be just 1 to 3 millimeters. Anyway, our main purpose is to fix the design of this position. Just take a look at the bottom of the collar here. I stitched 2 lines here. Then we will fold both sleeves along the line. This seam line is folded inward. Sew a line on the side to tidy the edge. After finishing both sleeve hems, it looks like this. Next, we will fold the front and back pieces together like this. The front sides are facing each other. Sew from the bottom edge to the sleeve. The other side is in the same position. After both sides are pinned, make several cuts on the design at the underarm area. Next, we will flip the entire upper section to the front. Let's add the thread to the lower edge. The thread pattern is directed to the right. Then we will sew the style lines directly above and below. As for the thread, it will be shorter than the fabric underneath. So when we sew, we need to stretch the thread above. Stretch it a bit in our own direction while sewing. As for the skirt hem here, we will first fold the bottom edge along the style line. Remove a line and tidy up the edge. I am following the edge with a 1 millimeter line here. If you prefer to measure slightly wider, you can also measure slightly wider. If you prefer it narrower, you can also make it narrower. According to your preferences, just make sure to secure this position. Then we will fold this part of the waist double. At this seam line, 2 millimeters from both the left and right sides. Remove a line. The line is being pulled here. The line spacing I use is for before and after. Do not backstitch. Leave the thread ends slightly longer. After the removal is complete, we are simultaneously tightening 2 bottom lines. Pull these out. Be careful while pulling. With our right hand, we straighten this line. Then with our left hand, push this fabric over to the left. Over here, the pleats are probably pulled to about halfway. We will change the 2 baseline lines on the other end. In the same way, pull out the pleats on this side. Next, let's tidy up the pleats. This size needs to match the bottom edge size of the upper part. Then, pay attention to both sides of the skirt. There should be about 2 centimeters of space. There should be no pleats, because we are going to fold the edges inward shortly. Once the adjustments are made, we will sew it to the upper part with the fronts facing each other. Inspect the stitching. If everything is fine, let's remove the gathering stitch at the front. Then we measure at this position on the waist. Measure the marking line. When measuring the marking line, the fabric underneath is all oriented towards the collar. The positions on both sides are approximately 1 centimeter. Fold the edge of the design line inward slightly. After completing the edges on both sides, this is how this position appears. Here I'm about 5 millimeters away from the edge, the seam of the garment. Then we give the collar a quick iron. While ironing, make sure to fold it down like this. Finally, sew a concealed button at the back yourself. This piece of clothing is ready. Here we take a look at the colorful pieces of the hat. By the way, for this I'm using this kind of finished aviation windproof cotton fabric. After cutting the fabric open, we also cut the threads on top, so the edges tend to curl inward a bit easily. For me, I would place it a bit outward in this style. Apply a little bit of this alcohol glue. Let it stick like this. If you don't like using glue, you can also make 2 back stitches in this position. Anyway, try to secure it. Otherwise, after we finish the clothes later. The frayed threads on the edge don't look good. If we use glue, we should apply it slightly at the edge. Don't let it get into this area. Then let's take a look at the sequins in the lining of the hat. The sides of the hat are flipped from left to right. Then the middle part is the top of the hat. Then there is the outer fabric. The colored piece of the outer fabric and the lining are the same. The 2 sides of the hat are flipped from left to right. The section in the middle of the hat. Now let's discuss the position of the bottom edge in the front and back piece diagram. This indicates that the lining extends to this line. What does this signify? This means we can simply draw the lining up to this line. The upper part is the same. Then lay the fabric to this line. We have completely drawn out this color patch. Typically, you just need to add 5 millimeters. That refers to the front and back pieces of our 3 lining layers. It will be slightly shorter than the front and back pieces of the fabric. The front piece is flipped left and right to align with the back piece. Then the 2 sleeves above are also flipped to the left and right. Both the outer fabric and the lining are similarly oriented left and right for this front piece. 1 back piece and 2 sleeves are oriented left and right. Let's also discuss the fabric used for our windproof strip and collar. If you are using pre-made aviation windproof cotton, you can remove the thread on top. Also take off the cotton part. Just keep the top layer of fabric. Then we can proceed according to the steps for the windproof strip and collar. Here I'll demonstrate with the back piece. Using the thread agent method on this cotton. For the upper layer, I use down jacket fabric. We mark the positions of these threads on its front side. Then the fabric that is placed underneath, I use 60 count upland cotton. Both upland cotton and washed cotton are usable. We first mark the position of this red line on the drawing. Backstitch at the starting and ending points. You should place these back stitches outside of this design. Do not place them inside the design, after sequentially finishing the threads in the middle section. Now let's sew the edges. This piece of fabric is stitched because we need to leave an opening here for stuffing cotton, except for this edge's sports position. We will sew along this style line about 2 to 3 millimeters to the right. The other pieces are the same. For example, we also leave one side for this sleeve, the area where cotton can be inserted. The remaining areas are all stitched up. Next, let's insert this cotton. Just insert it through the opening we left. Then, everyone should adjust the amount of cotton themselves. It definitely won't work if you stuff too little. If you stuff too little, the fabric will be too thin. You won't have the fluffy feeling of cotton or down jackets. Stuffing too much cotton is also not good, because if you stuff too much, it will cause problems with the clothing. It will become smaller because the clothes are too tight. Another aspect is aesthetics. That is to say, being overly loose is also unattractive, so everyone should manage it in moderation. We need to fill each cell with cotton. Then the cotton should be distributed more evenly. You shouldn't have too much in one cell. and too little in another cell. You can check its thickness yourself. Try to be as even as possible. Check it yourself after stuffing the cotton. If each grid looks relatively even, then we will sew the edge that was not stitched earlier. Also along this red seam, sew along the edge about 2 to 3 millimeters in. At this moment, we will trim off the excess fabric at the bottom. Trim along the edge of the top fabric. The finished 2 sleeves and back piece look like this. Then the front piece has been stitched and includes pockets. Follow the other steps we've outlined to do it, and then there's the hat's outer fabric. If you follow the red line on the blueprint to guide your actions, this line can be linked, the red line on the cap and the horizontal line at the bottom of the cap. Make sure to align the lower part correctly when sewing this section. Here let's examine the front piece of the fabric that needs to be joined. After we cut the pattern, then draw the diagrams individually. Cut the wood pieces down with a standard seam allowance of 5 millimeters. Note that both the upper and lower parts of the front piece need to be in 2 pieces. We draw by flipping it horizontally. This side is the right piece. Then mark the seams here and where they need to be stitched together. I drew everything on the front side of the fabric. This is the left part that I've already stitched together. Next, we will demonstrate the method using the piece on the right. For the pocket position, you can cut out the center of the pattern. Then you can roughly mark this spot. Next, we will need to adjust this position. Then we have a drawing like this. This is the decorative strip on the front piece of the coat. I have a bit more information about the length of this decorative strip. Because there may be reverse stitching marks at the beginning and end, we can trim the start and end sections later. It will be more visually appealing. Then we can combine the 2 pieces when we work on it, because we need 2 identical decorative strips, and it needs to have visible lines on it. Doing it together will make gathering the threads easier and more convenient. Then here we take out the same fabric as the main fabric, fold it in half, and then iron it. The side that is folded in is the back of the fabric, with the front facing up. The fabric should be a bit wider initially. The length should at least match that of our front decorative strip. Its length is then doubled. This way, once we're done, we can cut it in the middle to use both sides. Once assembled well, it looks like this. Then there's a fold line on our decorative strip. It resembles what we do after finishing the processing. What it actually needs is this fold line going up towards the fabric. It's just about the position of this part, because I only need one here. So here I just need to focus on this one part. If you're stepping on 2 lines, remember to make this length a little longer. Here, we will take a piece of thin cotton, clamp it like this in the middle, start sewing to the left from this folded area. Sew a line every millimeter. The specific number of lines for the car is indicated in the drawing. You can also decide based on your own preferences. For instance, if you like it a bit wider, then you can also widen your car. Here, it's 1 line per millimeter. When drawing the first line of the car, we need to check while drawing the car. The position of the thin cotton at the edge. See if it's caught right in the middle balance area. Make sure not to step into empty space. This is what the car looks like after it's finished. I've cut off the unattractive parts at both ends. The remaining part will be better if it's a little longer than this. Then align the dashed line with this reference point. We will draw the outline at the edge of this area. Then use this line as a reference. Then draw another 5 millimeter line next to it. Trim off the excess part. Then this is our 5 millimeter seam. Then take out the colored piece for the top and place it against the decorative strip. Sew along this red line, this decorative strip while sewing. If it's long enough, you can place it a bit forward. This way it will be easier to start sewing. It's hard to say that the starting point is very high. It will just stay in place and won't move. Then we need to take the top edge of the bottom part. Sew it together with the other piece. When sewing, the front sides should face each other. The inner part faces the outer part directly. In the middle is the decorative strip section. Sew directly along the top and bottom. Then I use a piece of 60 thread high-density cotton padding underneath. Or you can use any washable cotton. The part we just processed should be opened up and down. The stitching at this position should all face towards the collar. We will sew a clear line at the edge of the upper section. At the same time, we secured the lower part. This is how it looks after it has been sewn. Then we will position this horizontal line at the bottom. We will also sew it in place. This horizontal line corresponds to the position of the red line on our blueprint. The beginning and ending points need to be backstitched. We will place this backstitch at the outward position of this style. Next, let's make this pocket. Regarding the position of the pocket, I have already marked the position earlier. Cut out the pocket on the blueprint like this. First, determine this position. Then take out the part with the pure section from our drawing. Redraw it at this location. Because of what we mentioned earlier, it is drawn within this location. Therefore, it will be 1 circle smaller than this pure section. Now draw the solid line. You will find it bigger than the previous part. We take the edge position of the solid line as the reference. Then, about this position, on the drawing, there is a symbol that resembles 2 slanted characters. This is the spot we will cut later. You can first mark it in the same position. Next, we take out a piece of cloth, fold it in half like this, and press it with an iron. The folded side is the back of the fabric. The side facing up is the front. Align the area with a clean edge to this crease position. We draw it like this. This position we have drawn. We leave a 5 millimeter margin to the side. Next, we will sew this edge of pure fabric to this edge. While sewing, we sew from one red line to the other. Do not sew in the styled area. Then, on the other side, we have our large pocket fabric. Sew this edge of the large pocket fabric to this edge. Note that this side of the large pocket fabric is facing up. Here for the large pocket fabric, I used the same material as the outer fabric. If we are making this pocket on the other side, the pocket is on the right side. This large pocket is on the left side. The method is the same. It's just that this direction is exactly the opposite. If you do it on the right side, this bag is just on the left side. Then this large pocket is on the right-hand side. Then, since this part is quite small, the video recording isn't very clear, so I enlarged and printed a section of it here. Additionally, there are some colored pieces drawn. It's in the same position as this one. It's just that I'm working on this larger piece of fabric. Let me show you how to do this. Let's first handle this solid part. Align this edge with that edge when we sew the side seams. Sew from one point to another, this edge and that edge. Do not sew the excess fabric at the top and bottom. When sewing the side seams, this position must be accurate from point to point. Don't sew too much. If you add one more stitch, then this position will be wrong. Once we've measured, let's check this position, from this point to this point. Then we take out the large pocket fabric. This side of the large pocket fabric, it should be made of the same fabric as the outer cloth. What I cut here is just for demonstration. I casually cut a piece of ceremonial fabric, but remember to use the same fabric as the surface cloth. Then the large pocket fabric, it has a downward direction. This downward direction, it is directed towards this part of the hem. This fabric, we have the fabric wrong side up, the position of this point, and this point. Align it for stitching. This is also a point-to-point seam. Do not sew the upper and lower seam positions. After sewing, the front side looks like this. The back side looks like this. Then we cut open the center section. Cut along the position of these two crooked characters. Then we need to take note of this. When we reach the position of these four corners, the outermost edge and the farthest point, there must be a needle's tip. There will be a thread here. It's about our first stitch and the last one. The position of the final stitch. You need to cut it precisely, but you shouldn't cut this thread, but you need to cut to this position. Otherwise, when you turn it to the front, later, this position will become a bit wrinkled. It will be more obvious when viewed from the back after cutting. It is cut along the line we just drew. Then we turn it to the front side. Place this bag opening and the large pocket fabric. Place it on the back side. Flip it to the back like this. Everyone should be gentle with this step. Don't pull too hard. Wait a moment to rip the fabric. Once you flip it over, the back looks like this, the front looks like this. Just organize it a bit. Position this large pocket fabric towards the right. Just don't place it in the direction of the lip. The lip should cover this middle section. This opening we just cut out, cover it like this. Keep this position. We turn the pocket to the front. There are two small triangles at the top and bottom. We follow this line directly. Stuff it in like this, to the back side. You can use an iron. Ironing this area will make it smoother. I'll first scrape it a bit with my nails. If we follow the normal steps, we need to secure this small triangle at the back directly along the line we have folded to secure it. But since the instrument is relatively small, if you go to sew at this position, actually some of this fabric, if it is relatively thin, it may cause this area to become a bit wrinkled instead. Actually, it's not very aesthetically pleasing. It's better to properly fold this position first. Go directly to the visible line. Just skip the step of stitching the small triangle. If you prefer, you can fix it with stitching here. That's fine too. This can be done according to your own preferences. If you want to secure it by sewing, just like how I sew it over like this. If you don't want to secure this part, we can directly sew the visible line. Just skip it. It means skipping the step of securing this small triangle. Just directly iron the car seam flat to secure it. The small triangles on either side if you want to secure it. All use the same method to sew it down securely. Be mindful of the position of this small triangle when we secure it. Below is this part that is purely sewn. Sew them together to secure, after the sewing is complete. Let's take a look at the front. It's actually similar to when I scratched this small triangle with my nail before. It just hasn't been sewn. The back looks pretty much the same. So I personally think this step can be skipped if you're making a smaller version. Directly trace a clear line along this position of my pen. It can also fix that small triangle at the back. Regardless of whether the small triangle has been processed, we all need to trace a clear line on its front. When tracing the clear line, remember to place this large pocket cloth aside. Don't allow the car to run into this large pocket cloth. There is no car for this little triangle's companion. If it's just folded in, be sure to keep the front clean. That means there are no burrs at the position of this small triangle. Under external conditions, we will check the clear line of the car again. After the car is in good condition, let's take a look. You can pull it from here to there, then we flip it over. By the way, take out this small cloth pocket, the position of this stitching line along the edge of the small pocket cloth, and the position of this stitching line on the bottom section. Align it this way. The small pocket fabric here is inside out. We pinch this part of the fabric, just turn it over like this, flip it over, sew it along the edge to secure it. There's no need to sew along the style line. We follow along this left side. You can sew the edge of the fabric that you grabbed. Now the reverse side looks like this. Then we turn the large pocket fabric inside out towards the small pocket fabric. Sew along the edge of the large pocket fabric. When sewing, we cannot sew into the fabric of the garment. So when we sew, set the fabric of this garment aside from the starting point of sewing to the end. This spot. We'll just sew a little along the edge of the fabric. You don't need to sew exactly on this line. After testing, check the stitch count. It means sewing from this point to that point. Do not sew into our fabric. It is all about sewing these design positions. Then we turn it to the front to see. This is how the pocket looks. It has been properly taken care of. The same approach. After we have properly prepared the pocket beforehand, we can then insert this cotton. First, we will sew this position to that position, at a point 2 to 3 millimeters to the right of the seam line. Then, sew this part of the pocket bottom down like this. If you are making a larger size, its lower part has several sections. We just need to skip the pocket part because this part of the pocket is important. Some of it is split in the middle. We need to fill cotton from both ends, so both ends need to be left open. This side is also like stuffing cotton. Just stuff it evenly. Don't let some areas be very sparse, while others are very few. Once the cotton is well stuffed in each position, then sew up the unstitched areas at the edges. It is stitched at the edge of the fabric, approximately 2 to 3 millimeters to the right. Finally, we trim the excess fabric from the bottom. Trim along the edge of the top fabric. The finished front piece looks like this. We use the outer fabric and lining of the coat's front and back pieces are sewn together identically. I'll demonstrate with this lining, first sewing the back piece and the two sleeves. The label indicates that the back, positioned higher, corresponds to the front of the back piece. This means that this edge and this edge are sewn together with the front sides facing. The same applies to this edge and that edge. After measuring this position, it looks like this when unfolded. Next, we will sew the other sleeve to this position with the front sides facing each other. After both sleeves are attached, the back side appears like this. Then we take the two front pieces and sew them to the edges that face the two unsewn sleeves. After sewing these 5 pieces together, it appears like this. The back piece, 2 sleeves, and 2 front pieces. Now we will sew the outer fabric using the same method. Because the material of my windbreak is relatively thin, I have a light carbon layer on the back, so let's fold the fabric in half first. Iron the folded position to create a crease, and then we take out the blueprint for the windbreak. Align the dashed line with the crease we made when folding, and trace the edges. This means we only need to draw this half. Leave 5 millimeters for the seam on one short edge, and if your fabric is longer, you can wait to trim the other side. After we finish everything, when we work on the neckline, you can trim it then. This way, it will be easier to manage later. Then at the long edge, we leave an extra 5 millimeters for the seam and cut off the excess. Then we open the fabric first at the 5 millimeter seam position. Fold it like this, with the right side of the fabric folded in and the wrong side facing up, and sew directly along the 5 millimeter seam line. After sewing, we turn this position to the front and press it. Once processed, this position looks like this. This edge is sealed and the other end is left untouched. Here, we will add a zipper and windbreak strip. There is a mark at the bottom front, so make this mark in the same place. Another position at the front is similar. The bottom edge of the windproof strip aligns perfectly with this marked point. First, align the upper and lower styles, then sew them in place directly. The opening of this windproof strip faces to the right, matching the direction of the lower style. Next, we'll attach the zipper on this side. Note that here, the windproof strip is attached first, then the zipper. On the other side, the zipper is attached first, then the windproof strip. First, unzip the zipper. The side with the pull tab is the front of the right side, while the left side at the front doesn't have a pull tab. The position of the seam we just made will serve as the reference, and we will draw a line about 4 millimeters above it. This line serves as a guide to help align the edge of the zipper later. If you're very skilled at directly attaching the zipper, you can skip drawing this line. After drawing the line, when we attach the zipper, the edge of the ruler should align with it. This way, it won't be easy to become misaligned when we zip up later. As we align the zipper teeth with the line we just drew, we can take a look. In other words, where is the baseline located at the bottom? We can also mark this position on the zipper. For example, I can compare it now. The baseline above is at this location. We can draw the entire line on the zipper. After we finish drawing it this way, just align this line with the style line underneath. Next, we'll make a mark about 5 millimeters above this sealing strip. At the very bottom of the zipper, we'll align the stitching here shortly. Since I made this set without seams, there are fewer alignment points, so I didn't make many marks. If it's a stitched version, we aim to make several more marks. After fastening the zippers on both sides, be careful to pull them up later, as the heights on both sides are different. Here, I will record it again using this spliced version. These positions are marked, but we just did the same thing earlier. We will switch to this single-sided corner, align the upper and lower seams, and measure the stitching directly. After measuring, we will add a few more marking points in this step. For example, on this part with the decorative strip, we can place a mark on the zipper next to this tooth. The positions of these lines we stepped on below should also have a few markers. Then we will first connect the zipper on the other side to this one. Then we will refer to these marked points we just made. Also, mark them on the corresponding side of the other zipper. Actually, the end of the neckline at the top could also be marked. I didn't do that here. In any case, adding more marking points will make this side neater. When we attach the zipper on the other side later, the positions of these marking points should align with their corresponding spots. Next, we continue to separate the zipper and attach the zipper on the other side. When you reach this zipper, you can first remove the zipper pull, but you need to ensure that it can be easily put back after removal, as I have tested 2 types of zippers here. Putting it back in is quite easy. If your zipper is very different from mine and cannot be put back, then do not remove it. Later, when our car reaches this part with the zipper pull, just shift it to the side. Then we will align the other front piece to this one. Align the bottom edges of the 2 front pieces and make a mark for the zipper edge here. This makes it easier for us to align. When we attach the zipper on this side, the bottom edge should align with this point. On this side, we first attach the zipper and then the wind flap, moving up about 4 millimeters along this baseline. We draw this auxiliary line. It's also the line position for aligning the teeth. Then we draw the position of the lower guideline on our zipper. After drawing, we align all the necessary positions. Then we also use this single-sided angle to align the upper and lower guidelines. If you are a sister working on piecing, make sure to pay attention to aligning the marked points we prepared earlier. Also, make sure they are aligned at the corresponding positions while aligning the zipper on one side. After completing these zippers, an essential step is to close them. Check if the positions on both sides are aligned and if there are any height differences. If they are not aligned, move on to the next step. If they are, take them apart and redo them. If there are no issues, let's install the wind deflector on this side. Align the wind deflector with its marking point. Then we will follow the vertical wind line directly. Note that the opening of the wind deflector is facing to the right. The folded part should face left. Then we directly trim off the excess zipper and windproof strip from the collar area on both sides. After trimming off the excess parts on both sides, it looks like this. There's no rush to put the zipper pull back for everyone. Wait a moment, we can just put it back before we attach this collar, because we will still need to sew it together with the side part later. Then this part will still be sewn to the zipper. Here we will add the cuff's guard pattern. The blocking pattern should follow the dimensions given in the drawing, plus the design of the 4 edges. Pay attention to the direction of our blocking pattern. This direction, when pulled like this, is elastic. First, on the cuff of the outer part, we'll attach this blocking pattern to it. The blocking pattern should face the cuff like this. Sew along the upper and lower construction lines. Note that the blocking pattern will be shorter than the cuff below. So when we measure the seam, we need to pull open the top blocking pattern. Make it the same length as the bottom cuff. The other cuff should also have the blocking pattern applied in the same way. Then take out our lining. The lining and the outer part should face each other like this. The front piece matches with the front sleeve, and the back piece matches with the back sleeve. Pull out the blocking stitch at the bottom of this cuff in this manner. This refers to the side of the cuff's blocking stitch that remains unsewn. Sew this part of the lining sleeve together, facing each other in this manner. The sewing method is the same as that used for the outer part. Here we can turn it over first. This pattern facing up will make it easier to sew. After measuring, we will turn to the other side. We will also sew the pattern on the cuff on the other side. After measuring, let's take a look. This is the section of the block pattern. Actually, one side on both ends is sewn together with the lining. The other side is sewn to the outer part. Then we flip it over so that the lining and outer part face each other in reverse. Then we start by pulling open this part at the cuff. We need to measure the marking lines on both the lining and the outer fabric. When measuring the marking lines on the outer fabric, the seam underneath is directed towards the outer fabric. When measuring the marking lines on the lining side, the seam underneath is directed towards the lining. Pay attention to the stitching when we sew the visible line. The fabric underneath is flat. If it has been moved or wrinkled a bit, you can pull it slightly to smooth it out. It looks like this after sewing. Then we sew the visible line on this side of the lining. After finishing the visible lines on both sides, they look like this. Then we repeat the same method ourselves. Sew the visible line on the cuff of the other side as well. After finishing it properly, we will join the front and back pieces of the outer section together like this. Sew up from the bottom edge along the seam line, pass through the underarm, then pass through the cuff rib. Then continue sewing all the way down to the bottom edge of the lining. This time, the sewing is complete. We also join the front and back pieces on the other side in the same way. Sew in the same spot. Sew from the outer fabric all the way to the lining. Alternatively, you can sew from the lining to the outer fabric. While performing the side red, we should aim to align all the style positions we encounter both vertically. After completing the side red, we check the positions on both sides. The positions of both the lining and the outer part also need to be inspected. The design at these positions along the threaded edges can be trimmed slightly. Otherwise, it may become slightly bulged, especially for small sizes. After preparation, we separate the lining from the outer part. Then the middle sleeves are connected. Then we place the lining and outer part facing each other. Sew the bottom edge. When sewing, align the front piece with the front piece. Align the back piece with the back piece. When reaching the style position, separate all parts to both sides. Align the top and bottom. After the bottom edge is sewn correctly, it looks like this. Then we will pull out the section on both sides that has zippers. Our lining is shorter than the outer fabric, so we need to pay attention to one thing while sewing here. First, open the bottom section, the edge of the windproof strip. We will fold along this position. That means there are 5 millimeters at the top. We need to attach it to the lining. This way, the interior lining will be shorter by a section. The bottom edge will not easily show the lining's edge. Then we will start sewing the folded part from the bottom upwards. It's better to switch back to this single-sided corner for easier sewing, because the middle section has a zipper. After sewing, we will turn this part to the front to check. Check for any issues with your stitching. If there are no issues, proceed to the next step. If there are issues, when should we make the changes? Take a look. Our lining is shorter than the outer part by a segment. The outer part has 5 millimeters on this section of the lining. This way, if we look inward from the outer part, it won't be easy to reveal the white edge at the bottom. If there are no issues, we will flip it back to the reverse side. Sew the zipper on the other side similarly. The position at the bottom should also be along the edge of this windproof strip. After measuring the red, it should also be flipped to the front. Check this position to see if there are any issues. If there are no issues, proceed to the next step. Then we will turn the entire garment to the front. At this point, its sleeves are connected like this. We pull this sleeve out from the outside. As you pull, the lining sleeves come out too. Half of the ribbed section is on the lining, half of it is on the outer fabric. Make sure to tidy it up. Fold the bottom edge neatly and give it a quick iron. Note that the lining is shorter than the outer fabric. Then we will put the zipper head back on. Next, we will completely sew and secure the neckline. Sew the lining and the outer fabric together. When sewing, we will stitch about 2 to 3 millimeters to the right of the seam line. The positions of the 2-end zipper and windproof strip do not require sewing. The primary goal here is to stitch the lining to the outer fabric. In a moment, when we attach the hat and collar, it won't split into 2 layers, making it easier to apply. First, we measure the hat. Before measuring the hat, let's mark the center position of this back piece, the center part of the middle bottom edge of the hat. We will also make a marking point for it. There is a marking point at this position of the coat's front neckline. It is also made at the same place. The front pieces on both sides are made at the same position. Take a look at this area on the edge of our hat. Just don't include this plush fabric. This is the position at the edge of the fabric. This position aligns with this marking point. Then the other side. This position should align with this marker point, not the edge. The center position is the center point we just made for the hat. Align it with the center point of the back piece. After all positions are aligned, we will measure the seam directly, following the red line. Before we make the collar, we need to measure the size of this part of the collar. Because even though I have given this collar size, however, regarding this part of the collar opening, it has several layers stacked together. The fabric is also a bit thicker. Our own sewing may also result in some errors. If you don't take measurements first, if you sew this collar directly according to the drawing, it's likely that the final length will be too short. Because typically, after we finish this, it usually ends up being slightly longer. When measuring this dimension, we are at the very edge. To the edge on the opposite side, this position must include the windscreen strip, the length we just measured. This represents a dimension of this position. The width remains unchanged. We usually add 5 millimeters. Fold one of the bottom edges inward and iron it. Currently, this fabric is with the wrong side facing up. We will fold it this way. The line I just drew is on the front side of the fabric. Once the ironing is finished, now we will flip it to the front side. Align it with the position of the guideline underneath. Here at the red guideline, sew down along the edge with a 5 millimeter seam allowance. Sew until you reach this crease position. Do not sew down into the seam allowance area. The other end should also be aligned to the same position for sewing. After pressing it well, we turn these 2 corners to face the front. We use tweezers to help tidy up the positions of the corners. Then we use an iron to press this side a bit flatter. Next, we take this unsewn edge of the collar and this design at the neckline. Sew them together aligned, the position of the collar edge. Align with the edge of the windproof strip below. Sew along the vertical seam line. You can use clips or pins yourself. First, secure it before sewing. Then we will take this edge at the pre-pressed crease position at the front, and the position of the seam we just stitched. Cover it like this. Use a long stitch method to sew the seam in the crease. Here I've already sewn half of the area using the long needle technique. Then we go to the position we just sewed. Insert some cotton into it. You should also adjust the amount of cotton here yourself. Ensure the distribution is a bit more even. Each position needs to have...
Now let's make this type of button on the clothes. This is a 4-box button. I'm using a mold and a hand press here. Then it needs to use these 3 molds. This is the base. The base is meant for placing this. It has a pointed tip. Place it on top like this. And this mold that is on top is for placing this. There are actually 3 types of buttons in total. These 3 types. This one is for the base, and this type is flat. This side is flat. This side is raised. Everyone can see it. We put this raised part together with this recessed mold. It is like this. And then this other mold. is for putting this in. You can see there is a dent here. Did you see that? There is a depression on this side, and the other side looks like this, and there is a depression on this side. We place this depression here, facing this protruding mold. Put it on like this. I'll go first, then I'll use this first. This is a raised button. Install it. After screwing it on, take out our clothes. It's best to mark a point on the clothes first. Then we use pointed buttons. First, thread it through. Check if this position is correct. If you believe this position is suitable, we can go ahead and use this hand press machine to secure the button. Pass through the hole we marked originally. Then we push the handle of the hand press down. You don't need to exert much force. A moderate amount is sufficient. Then we can say this button it's quite easy. So it has been secured. Once it's fastened, we take this garment out to inspect it. If there are no problems, then we fasten the button on the other side. Use the same method to secure it for everyone. Keep this in mind. You need to attach the buttons on both the top and bottom sides. Add it for everyone, because the ones added earlier have already been used up. Next, let's make the button on the opposite side. Make the button on this side. The mold at the bottom doesn't need to be changed, but the mold on top needs to be changed. Change it to another type of mold with another type of button.
Take a look at the color piece section. There are 2 outer fabrics and 2 lining fabrics. The outer fabric and the lining fabric are made of the same material. The difference is that we need to mark the positions of the squares on the outer fabric. At the top of our pattern, there are 2 marking points, which are also drawn on the outer fabric. I have drawn all these lines on the front side of the outer fabric. The side bags are made of 2 identical pieces, and then there is the part for the shoe crossbody strap. Note that all these styles need to be added additionally by yourself. Then, for the handles, I provided 2 sizes. After stuffing the cotton, you can simply cut it in half. The stitching method for the straps and the handles is the same. We will place the front sides of these fabric strips together and sew along the sewing line. Note, if you're not very good at turning it over, you can sew a line like this at the top. It doesn't have to be the kind of thread I use. Just avoid using one that's too thin. If it's too thin, you might not be able to sew it. You can use yarn from home or any thicker thread. Since we originally don't need to close off the top part, if the thread goes in, it will sew the top part and secure the thread as well. We won't sew the bottom part here. After sewing, we hold the fabric at the top with our left hand. With your right hand, pull the thread at the unsewn spot down. After flipping it over, we trim the fabric at the top and the nearby thread. We also use this method to prepare the handle. Once everything is done, stuff some cotton inside. The amount of cotton to stuff depends on your preference. If you prefer a more vintage look, stuff a little more. If you prefer it to look less vintage, then stuff a little less. It's all about your taste. Additionally, if the handle is small and you find it difficult to stuff cotton inside, there's another method. This means cutting the cotton padding into long strips. Then, just like threading an elastic band, you can use a collar tool or any other tool to thread it through. This strip you've cut is for when you want to indicate that the bag is somewhat outdated. You can cut it thicker. If you prefer the bag to be less outdated, you can cut it thinner. When pulling, don't use too much force. Be gentle. This is cotton, and pulling too hard will cause it to break. The finished straps and handles look like this. The strap should be a single piece, while we need to trim the handle into 2 segments. The handle should be trimmed to the length specified in the drawing, adding 5 millimeters on each side for sewing. Next, note that there should be no cotton at the sewing positions. If there is, it needs to be removed. Once processed, we have these 2 prepared as backups. Here, we first work on the surface fabric. Below, we place a piece of batting without adding any more fabric underneath. However, if you like, you can add a 60-count long staple cotton or washed cotton. It works like our coat. Adding it would make it look cleaner. Then we will sew the 2 vertical lines and the 2 horizontal lines like this. For the backstitch at the beginning and end, we place all of them outside the seam line. After sewing, it looks like this. Then we trim the excess batting along the edge of the top fabric. Here we can take a look at its back. Since I didn't add any fabric on the back, it is only this batting. I suggest adding a bit more for a cleaner look. Then repeat the process to handle the other piece of fabric. Then, we place the adhesive pads of the 2 magnets in the square at the top center. The position is here, but we need to tuck it inside the fabric. After placing both in, take a look yourself. The cotton-to-cotton parts can stick together. Confirm that the front and back are correct. We'll sew a few stitches to secure the top opening and seal the magnet inside. Next, we handle the fabric on the side of the bag. I placed a layer of 60-piece cotton underneath, and along both long edges, we sew about 2 to 3 millimeters from the seam line. Sew a line to secure the 2 layers of fabric together along the edge of the top fabric and trim off the excess fabric at the bottom. Then we fill the center with just the right amount of cotton, enough to feel a little in each spot but not too much. Now let me explain the length. The length on the drawing I provided includes a standard size and an actual size. as I noted how much was actually used. We can first mark the actual length used on this fabric, which is the area between the two red lines I just drew. This is the length we actually used. Then, remove the excess cotton from this length, since we don't want any cotton in the seam. Next, mark the center point between the two red lines on the back. I'm marking it on the front, but you should mark it directly on the back. Fold the bottom edges of the two fabric pieces again to find the center point and mark it on the front side. When we sew the bag side later, this center point must align with the center point on the bottom of the fabric. You can also mark the position of the guideline on the back of the bag side to make it easier to align when we sew. If you've sewn accurately in the previous steps, it's fine not to draw. This is just for assistance. We start sewing from the guideline position 5 millimeters from the start, and here the sewing is in relation to the front side, following the guideline up and down. When you get close to the curved part at the bottom of the bag, stop. Make a few snips along the edge of the fabric on the bag side's guideline. This will make turning easier. Then, as we continue sewing forward, we need to pay attention to aligning the center point of the bag side with the center point at the bottom of the bag. After aligning the marks, continue sewing forward to complete the remaining part. Let's take a look at the remaining part. If you measure correctly, the last seam line should align perfectly with the bag's body. Leaving an extra section helps accommodate those who may not sew accurately. A longer length makes it easier to hold while sewing. We can always trim any excess later. Then we will sew the unstitched part of the other side of the bag to the fabric of the other bag's body, ensuring the right sides are facing each other. Since we already know the approximate curvature position here, we can make some notches along the seam line on this side of the bag in advance. You can trim off the excess long part at the front. I haven't trimmed it yet. I sewed along the seam line and will trim it afterwards. Trim along the edge of the fabric. Once processed, the outer fabric should look like this. Use the same sewing method for the lining, but make sure to leave an opening at the bottom for turning. Just leave it on one side. Leave an opening of about 2 centimeters. The other side has been sewn, so there is no need to leave the lining or add cotton. The lining can be sewn completely with fabric. Next, we adjust the handle, placing the style of the handle on the inner side of the side, aligning it with the edge of the fabric at this marking point, which indicates the alignment position of the style. We position it about 1 millimeter to the right of the style line and fix the side seam. After finishing the side seam, we bring this handle over without any bends in the middle. The front handle's style faces down, while this handle's style faces up, indicating 2 positions for the style. It is on the opposite side, and the position of the style aligns with this marking point. After adjusting both sides, we see that it looks like this. The 2 marking points are at this position, with their style lines next to them. Next, using the same method, we attach the handle on the other side of the fabric. Then we position the diagonal shoulder strap at the top of the bag's side. Pay attention to the style of the strap. We move it to the center position facing up. The shoulder strap comes over without bends in the middle. We align it with the same position on the other side, all sewn on the front of the bag. When sewing, position it about 1 millimeter to the right of the style line. Next, center stitch at the top position of the side of this bag. The areas we stitch should not have any cotton outside of this. If any cotton pops out, just tuck it back in. After this, let's check it out. The positions on both sides look like this. It's important to note that our shoulder strap comes straight like this and does not twist in the... Let's take a look at the pantyhose section. Compared to regular pantyhose, it includes an extra step of stitching at the front. We will cut the drawing vertically. Then we will draw on this fabric separately. Add a 1 centimeter seam to the upper waistline. The remaining areas should have a normal 5 millimeter seam. Then we will sew this position with the front sides facing each other. We need to pay attention to one issue while sewing. It's about how we sew. You need to pull this fabric towards yourself while sewing. If you don't pull it open completely, after a regular flat sewing machine goes over it, the elasticity at this position will be set. When we wear socks, this part lacks elasticity. You may not be able to lift it when you pull upwards. Then we flip it over to this side. The design at the bottom is oriented to the left, on top of the piece of white fabric we stitched together at the bottom. Fix it with a visible stitching. Note that this side should also have visible stitching. You need to pull the fabric in our direction. Use the same method. After processing both of these pieces well, we will follow the video that comes later. We will execute the steps for regular tights. Here, let's take a look at the tights section. First, leave a 1 centimeter margin at the top position. Then, the position of the back panel. I have made a marker. It is the position marked on our drawing. Here, we first align the 2 pieces face to face. This is the line for sewing beforehand. After completing at the curved areas, you can make a couple of notches in it, then spread this line apart. We fold inward along this waistline. I marked this waistline. I also marked it on the front of the fabric. This is the point where we fold it downwards. Next, when we start sewing, we should focus on one key issue. It's during the sewing process. Gently guide this knit in our direction. Pull it slightly apart, because if you don't pull it apart at all, the tightness of the waistband will be fixed by the stitching we made. We have some sizes of the basic form. The hip area might be relatively large, and the waist is quite slim. So when you raise it to the hip area, it may feel a little tight. So when we stitch this area, gently pull this knitted fabric apart a bit before sewing it. When wearing it, it will be easier to lift, but don't pull it too much. Just a little bit is enough. Also, regarding the sewing we do here, The position is slightly away from the edge, a distance of approximately 5 millimeters. Soon, this position will serve as a passage for threading the elastic band. Once the car is ready, we will use the reverse tool to thread the elastic band. If there's no reverse tool, use another one instead. As long as it can fit the elastic band, that's fine. We pull the elastic band in, sew both ends to secure it. Then, a little distance from the edge of the fabric. Sew about 2 or 3 millimeters away to create a stitch effect. Next, we continue to align the two pieces of material with their fronts facing each other. Now let's sew this position at the back. After sewing is complete, similarly, make 1 or 2 notches at the curved areas. Then we pull the two pieces of material apart like this. Step on from the tip of your toes here, then step down here. The design in the middle needs to be split to both sides. Align the top and bottom. After measuring, when creating the opening, note that no seams are needed on the top and bottom. Just add a 5 millimeter seam on the left and right sides. Then, there is a line at this position on our drawing, which we will fold down toward the front side of the fabric. After folding it neatly, we will fold it this way and sew straight down along the 5 millimeter seam line at the edge. Since this fabric is thick, we can slightly trim the seam to leave about 3 millimeters. Then, we will turn it to the front side, and it will look like this. Next, we will add some decoration. For decoration here, we will use thread to tie a bow and attach a pom-pom to both ends. The thread I used is regular sewing thread, which is 4-stranded. Choose a small pom-pom that you think is the right size. Then we will pass the needle and thread through the center point, pull it tight, and tuck the end of the thread into the pom-pom. Next, use the same method to thread a small pom-pom into it, and then we will tie a bow with this thread. You don't have to tie the bow exactly like I do, just ensure you can create a bow. After tying it, adjust the lengths to a level you are satisfied with. Once adjusted, let's examine the longer thread. The pom-pom is still on top of it. Move the pom-pom upwards to a level you find suitable, and then tie a knot manually at the end. Trim off the excess part, then pull the pom-pom towards the knot to embed it into the pom-pom. Finally, sew it directly into this position with needle and thread. Hair 9, then they started to fight. Gib is relatively long. It will hit someone all the way. The newest one this time is the